All right, Carl, this is our last video in this series, so I just want to say it's been a pleasure working with you. Got anything you want to say to me? I don't know, maybe that it's been a pleasure working with me too? Oh, really? All of a sudden you're a Kantian about not lying. You are unbelievable. Hi, and welcome to the final video in this series on ethics. In this video, we're going to look back at some of the main ideas we've explored in this video series and introduce a few new ideas. We'll begin with a discussion about the relationship between free will and morality. Next, we'll take a visual approach to explain how ethics and its subfields arise within human communities. Finally, we'll reconsider the relationship between morality and law. Let's get started. What is the relationship between morality and free will? Let's recall that ethics is the branch of philosophy that addresses how people behave, how they ought to behave, and why they ought to behave that way. The word behavior here refers to acts or character traits that have a moral quality to them. We can think of acts or character traits as having a moral quality to them when they can be described as good or bad, or right or wrong, based on how they impact ourselves or others. For example, we might say that murder is wrong because of the harm that it causes to the victim, to those close to the victim, to the murderer, and to society in general. We might also say that developing the character trait of empathy is good, because it makes us more attuned to what harms or helps others. Many philosophers, though not all, think that, in order for acts or character traits to qualify as moral, they have to have another component to them, a meaningful level of freedom, or what we might call free will. The argument goes something like this. Without free will, understood as the ability to choose what course of action we take or what character traits we develop, it's difficult to argue that people are responsible or can be held accountable for the actions they perform or the character that they develop. And without personal responsibility and accountability, it's difficult to think of persons as moral at all. After all, if people can't choose otherwise than how they choose to act or to develop their character, then it seems a bit meaningless to talk about how they should act or develop their character. How can we talk about how people should act if they have no control over how they actually act? What good is it to tell someone they should tell the truth or be an honest person if they have absolutely no control over whether or not they do so? This raises a serious question about human persons. Are we really free? Generally speaking, there are three options on the table. First, we are not free in any meaningful sense. Everything that happens is ultimately determined by previous things happening, cause and effect. And this includes human choices. We have the illusion of free will, but in reality, we only ever do what we are determined to do by all the things that preceded our so-called choice. So, if someone commits murder, that action couldn't have happened otherwise than how it happened. Between how that person was raised, their genetic code, and all the environmental variables that happened throughout their life, it was impossible for that person not to commit murder in that moment. In other words, it was determined. As you might guess, we call this view determinism, because everything is determined. Philosophers are smart, but not altogether creative. This might sound surprising, but for some philosophers, it's still possible to argue that people are morally responsible for their actions even if those actions are determined. If someone commits murder, we as a society hold them responsible for their actions because it was still them that committed the murder. And just as we remove cancerous tumors from our body to protect them, even though we don't think cancerous tumors are free or maliciously choose to hurt us, we can remove murderers from society for the sake of protecting society. In this view, we still have a moral code of how people ought to behave. And when people break this code, we respond as a society. For example, by putting a murderer in prison. But we don't do this to punish the individual, we do it to protect society. In the second option, people are free in a strong sense. They have the ability, within reason, to choose between various options. So, when someone commits murder, if we can establish that the person could have chosen otherwise, we can hold them accountable for their action and punish them. Again, for instance, by putting them in prison. This punishment can be retributive for the person who committed the murder, restorative for the person who committed the murder, and also for the well-being of society, that is, to keep others safe. But, unlike determinism, the person is held accountable and responsible because they could have done otherwise. We call this view libertarianism, not to be confused with the political movement. It's just liberty, freedom, you get it. In this view, at least some of our actions are freely chosen such that we we could have chosen otherwise. This doesn't mean that all of our actions are freely chosen. In the US legal system, if it can be demonstrated that the person in question did not choose to commit their illegal action, such as murder, freely, they may not be found guilty, but they might still be separated from the community for the well-being and safety of that community. For example, according to Cornell Law's definition of the insanity defense, if someone pleads insanity, it means the defendant admits the action, but asserts a lack of culpability based on mental illness. If someone successfully pleads insanity in the United States legal system, they are essentially declared not guilty of the crime because they are not culpable for the action they committed. But again, they can still be separated from society for the safety of society. For example, by being committed to an institution. Third, some philosophers try to find a balance between determinism and libertarianism. They argue that people are free in a morally significant way, even though their actions are determined. One of the main lines of reasoning here is that people's actions are determined by their character or their nature. In other words, their actions are determined by things internal to them as opposed to things external to them. When someone commits murder, it's because their nature or character is such that they couldn't have done otherwise. But because it's their character or nature that's to blame, they are still culpable for their actions. We call this view compatibilism. The idea is that people will always act freely in accordance with their nature or their character. So it's always them, that is their character or nature, that determines their own actions. So we can hold them responsible for their actions, even though they couldn't have done otherwise. Each of these three views has issues. People who affirm libertarianism have a very difficult time explaining how people make choices that aren't determined by other factors. It seems obvious that our actions and character traits are heavily influenced by things we can't control. For example, who our parents are, where and when we were born, our genetics, our culture, and so on. If we claim that, despite these influences, we can still make choices such that we could have chosen otherwise, we need to have an account of how that works. How does an effect come about without a cause? It turns out that giving such an account is quite difficult to do. People who affirm compatibilism have difficulty explaining how people are still reasonably held accountable for their actions. After all, if people always choose in line with their character or nature, another question arises. Why do people have the nature or character they have? Did they choose it? Or was it forced upon them by nature, nurture, and other environmental factors? And if we don't get to choose our character or our nature, if it's forced upon us by external factors, aren't we ultimately just as unfree as we were in determinism? People who affirm determinism can explain why society should still respond to people who act immorally. We do it for the safety of society. Or, more specifically, we do it because it's determined that we do it. But never mind that for now. But determinists struggle to explain how that makes people responsible or accountable for their actions. And that makes it difficult to talk about justice. In a deterministic worldview, in what way is one person murdering another person any different from a rock falling on another person and killing them? Both the murderer and the rock have the exact same amount of freedom, 0 amount. And we don't tend to hold rocks accountable for their actions. But there's another dimension of free will and morality that's worth discussing here. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said that we are condemned to be free. Part of the idea here is that, to the extent that we can make choices, we must make choices. If you and I are standing in a field, and I throw a ball to you, giving you enough time to think about how to respond to my action, as opposed to merely acting reflexively, the fact that I've thrown a ball to you forces you to choose, to whatever extent you're able, how to respond. Do you try to catch it? Do you try to knock it away? Do you try to dodge it? Do you try to ignore it? I know people frequently ignore me, Carl. Quit telling me the truth all the time. It's annoying. Even if you have free will in the sense that you could choose otherwise, you don't have free will in the sense that you could not make a choice. You have to choose something. You are not free not to choose. You are condemned to be free. This means that whenever you are presented with the opportunity to make a choice, you are also presented with the inability not to make a choice. To whatever extent you're able to choose, you must make some choice. Even if you try to ignore all the options presented to you, that's still a choice. For the determinist, this just means that you must react to situations that trigger responses. But how you react is going to be determined. For the compatibilist, it also means that you must react to situations that trigger responses. You'll just always react in a way that's consistent with your nature and your character. But for the libertarian, It means that when you're presented with multiple options, and your choice is not determined by external factors or your character or your nature, you must decide which option you'll pursue. You are not free not to choose. And if these options are moral, if some are good and some are bad because of how they affect others, you cannot help but engage in morality and ethics. And because we inevitably find ourselves in situations where we have to make these kind of choices, to the extent that we are able to make choices, we are inevitably ethical and moral beings. Ethics is inevitable. Now, let's envision one person being presented with a set of moral options and having to make a choice. In this case, they're being attacked by an aggressive cat, and they have to decide how to respond. Telling you, Carl, cats are the devil's creation. They are smart, sneaky, violent creatures. Let's say that this person makes the choice to kill the cat, and the situation unfolds accordingly. We can do a number of things here. First, we can describe what the person decided to do and why we think they made that decision. Maybe we discover this person believes it's morally acceptable to kill aggressive creatures in self-defense. At this point, we'd be doing descriptive ethics. We're describing what this person believes and why they believe it. Second, we can ask if we think this person is making decisions in a world where good and bad, or right and wrong, exist objectively, or if it's just a matter of their opinion. Do we think there's a moral fact here? Or do we think that any response to the cat is just as good as any other? It's just up to the individual. At this point, we'd be doing meta-ethics. We're asking questions about the nature of the moral decisions this person is making. Third, we can develop a theory about why we think the person should act one way or another, or how they ought to decide what kind of person to be. We might say that it's always wrong to act in a way that brings about harm to another creature. Or we might say that it's acceptable to kill another creature if it brings about a good that offsets the harm of killing the creature in the first place. At this point, we'd be doing normative ethics. We're trying to develop a theory for how we ought to act or who we ought to be. Finally, we can say how we think this person ought to act in the specific real-world situation they find themselves in. We might say they should have tried to restrain the cat, but not kill the cat, using non-lethal force. Or we might say they should in fact have killed the cat in self-defense. Why risk it over a cat? At this point, we would be doing applied ethics. We're taking moral theories and principles and applying them to a real-world situation. Of course, this person can also ask all of these questions of themselves. They can describe their own behavior, descriptive ethics. They can explore whether their own morality is subjective or objective, meta-ethics. They can develop a moral theory to live by, normative ethics. And they can apply that moral theory to real-world situations, applied ethics. Now, let's step away from one person being forced to make moral choices and think about hundreds or even thousands of people being forced to make moral choices in the same geographic vicinity. Historically, when this happens, we're going to see groups, tribes, and nations form. And as individuals in these groups are forced to make choices, again to whatever extent they're able, moral codes begin to form. That is, the community starts to identify certain actions and character traits as good, and some as better than others, and other actions and character traits as bad, and some as worse than others. In human history, these moral codes provide the foundation of how we engage one another in society. We see this in ancient human communities, for example Hammurabi's Code and the Mosaic Law. We can even see these types of rule-based communities in non-human animals, especially higher primates such as chimpanzees and bonobos. This suggests that our tendency toward moral communities and moral codes is actually embedded in our evolutionary narrative. In a way, we're genetically encoded toward this outcome. Now, when a human community establishes an enforceable code of conduct together, establishing how people must behave, we have law. And when people living in societies are expected to abide by these laws for the sole reason that they're part of that group, we call it a social contract. Because it's a code that's binding, so it's a contract, on all members of that group or society, so it's social. In some cases, these laws will promote order, but won't necessarily be tied to the moral sensibilities of the group. But when laws are intended to promote good actions and character traits, and prevent bad ones, they're based in the moral sensibilities of the group. So again, law is related to morality, but the two are not equivalent. This overview helps us to understand possible ways of conceiving the relationship between morality and freedom, how moral communities form, why the subfields of ethics, descriptive ethics, meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics, make sense, and how law is related to morality but still distinct from it. The last point we'll note is that different groups develop different moral sensibilities, and we can think of these different moral sensibilities as moral frameworks. The different moral frameworks might have commonalities, but they'll also have uniqueness to them. We can explore these different moral frameworks, as we did with Catholic social teaching, trying to understand them as best we can within their context, but also critically evaluating them. But as we do this, we should have a level of intellectual humility, understanding that we also have moral frameworks that we're bringing to the table. So the first goal of that kind of ethical inquiry should be humility, recognizing our own biases and seeking understanding. I hope you found this video series helpful. Until next time, farewell.